Are you looking for extraordinary home care assistance for your loved one? Here at Promise Cares, we are dedicated to ensuring our clients continue living independently and comfortably in their own home, whether it's short or long term. Our experienced caregivers are available. Contact us today to schedule an appointment with no obligation at 901 357 3337.
The Land Academy is cultivating first-class learning in a first-class facility for children 6 weeks to 12 years of age. Here we are curriculum-based and all staff is CPR First Aid certified. The Land Academy provides a safe and clean environment, hot cooked meals, transportation within a 2-mile radius, before and after school care, qualified staff, and hands-on learning. For more information, please contact the Land Academy at 901-353-1277.
Luke chapter 23, beginning at verse 32. And I want to read verses 32 until I stop. Luke chapter 23, beginning at verse 32, is where we'll begin. And I'm reading from the King James Version of the Bible. And it reads, "And there were also 2 others, malefactors, led with him to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand, the other on the left. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiment and cast lots. And the people stood beholding, and the rulers also with them derided him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he be Christ, the chosen of God." If you're not too mean, look at someone that's standing around you and say, our pastor is going to teach to us how to handle them and they. Amen. With emphasis on verse 34, then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is one of the 7 sayings of Jesus Christ as he offered up words from Calvary cross. These 7 words were said in between the time that he hung on the cross, according to Mark 15, verse 25, beginning at 9 a.m. in the morning until he gives up the ghost at 3 p.m. that afternoon. For 6 hours, Jesus has been hanging on the cross. He's been dying on the cross. But as we look at this, we need to understand that this is only the first saying that Jesus is actually speaking or uttering up on the cross. And that is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, the first 3 sayings were said during daylight. The last 4 sayings were said in darkness. The first 3, he said, the first 3 sayings had to do with others, while the last 4 had to do with himself. The first 3 had to do with his horizontal relationship with others around him. But the last 4 deals with his vertical relationship with God. The first 3 had to do with his compassion for others, while the last 4 sayings has to do with his suffering and the meaning of his death. And Jesus handles these sayings 3 hours in actual sunlight, and in 3 hours in actual darkness. When you look at these sayings, we understand that Jesus is actually saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We don't need an interpretation to understand what forgiveness simply means. Let's look at a definition, a simple definition for forgiveness. A simple definition for forgiveness is to cancel an indebtedness or to grant a pardon. Now, many of us, we may not understand the difference in paroling and pardon, but I want to deal with this just for a few minutes. You see, when you parole someone, it's not the same thing as pardoning someone. Parole means you let them out, but you got conditions on it. But when you pardon someone, it means they are free to go forever, and it is forgiven. In other words, you don't bring it up. And that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not paroling a person. Forgiveness is actually pardoning a person. In other words, I'm not going to keep bringing it up because that's parole. I'm not going to keep saying what you did to me 3 years ago because that's parole. I'm not going to keep reminding you that you betrayed me, that you did this to me, that you walked out on me, that you left me, that you cheated on me, because that would be paroling someone. But when you pardon someone, you basically forgive the debt and you no longer bring it up. You say, I'm no longer going to talk about it. It's done because I have put that in a tomb of time. And we understand what pardoning means, because understand that's what Jesus does to each one of us. He does not parole us, but Jesus pardons us. But notice what he says in verse 32, in verse 34 rather. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I know what many of us are hung up on. We're hung up on the pretty paintings of Jesus that hang on the cross with a little drop of blood and a little dewdrop of blood here and there. But the cross, y'all, was a bloody, it was a bloody mess. And when we look at the cross, we got to understand that there was nothing pretty about the cross. Many of us, when we think of the cross, we think of just a wooden beam. We think of Jesus hanging on the cross with 2 nails in his hands and some staves in his feet and a crown on his head. We don't look at all the in-depthness that goes into what occurs from him going from judgment hall in those 6 trials and then on the well pavement as he's there in Pilate's court. We don't understand how it was that Jesus was beaten along the Via Dolorosa and how his blood was literally mixed and mingled by the lictors in the stones of the goblets going up the Via Dolorosa. When we think about Jesus, many of us, we omit the fact that this was not some pretty painting of a picture in which he died, some death in which he had no pain and anguish, but Jesus suffered, and he suffered for your sins and mine. And I want us to talk about this because in the Christian world, we love talking about the resurrection. We love talking about the victory. We love raising our hands saying that we've got all power with Jesus. But what happened along that way in his suffering is what we need to talk about. Because maybe we would treat one another a little bit better if we realize the suffering and the shame, the humiliation that Jesus had to endure. Maybe many of us, we wouldn't hold pity parties for ourselves if we realize all that Jesus had to go through. Matter of fact, they said that the lictor was one that had a strap wrapped around his arm, and bones were mixed and mingled inside that strap. And what they would do is they would beat Jesus. Literally, the lictor would beat Jesus with that strap of bones. And as they would literally begin to beat him with the strap of bones, the bones would literally rip away at the flesh of Jesus. And you could see blood as it was beginning to spew all along the pavement. And Jesus was being beaten for your sins and mine. Matter of fact, the crown that was placed on his head, many of us, when when we think of that crown, many of us, we look at that crown and say, oh, what an adorable crown they placed on his head. But you've got to realize these were no little bitty prickles of thorns. These thorns were 3.5 inches long in length, and they were sharp in their best point. And watch what they did. They threaded that thorn, that crown of thorn, with 72 thorns that are mixed inside of that crown. And then they took the sharpness of those 3.5-inch thorns and crushed them on the head of Jesus, tearing away the flesh of Jesus's membrane. And there he is. He's bleeding from his head. He's bleeding from his back as the flesh has been torn away. It's been ripped away from his back. And he's trying to get enough breath to continue to move forward on the Via Dolorosa, and he hadn't even made it to the cross yet. When we think about Calvary, Calvary was not a pretty scene. And many of us, we read, Father, forgive them, and we don't understand the light and the gravity that holds. Because he didn't get up on the cross haphazardly. Jesus got on the cross because of sinners like you and I. When we look at verse 32, it says, and there were also 2 other malefactors led with him to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, or in John's term, the place of the skull, or Matthew's term, the place of the skull, there they crucified him. And the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. You see, the difference in Jesus and the one on the right and the one on the left is that Jesus did not deserve to be there. He had done nothing to get there. And I need to tell somebody in here that you've got to realize that not only were the Jews responsible for putting them there, you and I were responsible as well. Well, let's look at it and unpack it, because when you look at forgiveness, forgiveness means to cancel an indebtedness or grant a pardon. And many of us need to learn how to pardon people versus paroling people, because we parole people and keep them on a leash by letting them know you did that to me, by reminding them you did that to me, and you constantly are blowing stuff up. But you've got to realize the more you grow up, the less you blow up. That's a major statement, that the more you grow up, the less you blow up. But hold on, watch what happens. Jesus says, Father, forgive them. In other words, the reason he's saying it is because he's saying, you help them, Daddy, because this is hurting me. That's why he says in verse 34, Father, forgive them. Because it's hurting him. It has hurt Jesus to be placed in the position of the cross. And when we think about all that occurred along the Via Dolorosa, when we all but understand that they spit on him, that they mocked him, that they talked about him, when you think about all that goes into this, that to make matters worse, you are dealing with the Son of God. When we put this in light of gravity, we understand he didn't have to be there. He was chosen to be there. But hold on, I see something else. Because before the cross, Jesus would say, your sins are forgiven. But because the incident didn't involve him. You see, before him going to the cross, it was easy for him to say to the woman that was caught in the act of adultery, he would say, your sins are forgiven you. In other words, he was the one forgiving the sins. But hold on, the reason why was because the act didn't involve him. But notice what happened. Now the incident is inclusive of him, and he needs someone to do with what he is physically battling with. In other words, he himself is battling with forgiveness. So notice what he does. He goes within himself, outside of himself, above himself, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Let me see if I can unpack that, because you you and I need to realize there are times in your life and my life that we don't have the strength, but we're connected to one that does have strength. And since he has all power, sometimes you got to go outside of yourself and say, Lord, I don't have the strength to forgive them, but Lord, would you forgive them because they hurt me, they spit on me, they beat me, they've hit me, they left me for dead. But is there anybody here that knows that God has enough power not only to forgive them, but to heal your hurt? So understand, the incident is inclusive of him, and he needs someone to do with what he's physically battling with. You see, the statement in Luke 23, verse 34 is a statement that has continuous action. And what continuous action is, it simply means that this is not a one-time forgiveness. This is an ongoing forgiveness. Okay, you don't believe me. Let's look at it, because he says, I know what they've done and are doing, but Father, keep on forgiving them. Okay, that's the Bible, Matthew 18, verse 21 and 22. Remember when Peter goes to Jesus and says, how many times do I forgive my brother and that has done me wrong? And Jesus gives him a simple equation. He says 70 times 7. Now, the term does not mean 240 times. That is not what that means. But what it actually means, or 490 times, that is not what it means. What it actually means is, he says, you know what? He says, I need you to completely forgive them. I like that, because you and I need to understand that you can't partly forgive somebody. You've got to forgive them. You've got to completely forgive. Don't you come in here and try to pretend as though you are above forgiveness because somebody hurt you. You've hurt some folk as well. So watch what happens. That's why Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, or the model prayer in Matthew 6, he says, Father, forgive them. Watch this. Watch this. Forgive them of their sins as you forgive me of mine. In other words, he teaches us that if you're going to ask God for forgiveness of your sins, you've got to also forgive those that have sinned against us. So he says 70 times 7. He says keep on forgiving. See, it's a continuous action in verse 34. He says, Father, forgive them. In other words, keep on forgiving them. You see, if Jesus can ask God to forgive others while on the cross, what about you? And that's a rhetorical question, because he's actually hanging on the cross. Now, we won't get into the details of him being placed on the cross and the vertical of him hanging, but we do understand that he's hanging on the cross. And while in agony and pain, notice Jesus says, Father, forgive them. Watch this, because they don't know what they're doing. Now, I need to ask you this. If Jesus can forgive others while on the cross, then what about you in the crucible that people have placed you in? You've got to learn how to forgive folk. You've got to learn how to allow the winds to blow and to change your mentality and your way of thinking so that God can continually use you. But hold on, I see something else. When you feel as though you're ready to be lifted, can you handle being grounded? Because Jesus had to go through something before he was lifted. John chapter 12, verse 32, he says, and if I be lifted up from the earth, he says, I will draw all men unto me. So understand, when he's lifted, he's drawing all men. But hold on, he had to go through something on the ground, and he had to go through some rejection. He had to go through some denial, some betrayal. He had to go through being kicked, being beat on. But watch this, he handles it because he understands he can never be lifted until he first handles what's on the ground. You got to ask God, can you forgive those that have lied on you, that have spit on you, that have beat you, mistreated you, and then buried you? Because if you cannot forgive others, you are not ready to be lifted. Let me see if I can make that plain. You got to understand, you've got to forgive others. A freak accident occurred during a poolside party, which left a young lady by the name of Rachel paralyzed. She was paralyzed. Her body was forever broken. The mishap didn't make the slightest dent, however, in Rachel's plans to be a bride in just a few months. Watch what had happened, y'all. She had this bridal shower, and while at the bridal shower, they were in there changing into their outfits to go swimming, and one of her friends, to get her in the pool, decided with one touch to slightly push her and give her a nudge into the pool. But they did not realize the pool on the end that they nudged her in was only 3 feet deep. And when Rachel falls into the pool by the gentle nudge of her friend, y'all, she heard a thud as her head hit the cement at the bottom of that pool. And all of a sudden, her body went limpless. And watch what happened, y'all. As her body is limp, she's in 3 feet of water, but she noticed she was unable to move. And watch what had happened. As soon as she hit the water, she knew something occurred. She heard a crack in her neck, and that crack was the sound of her C6 cervical vertebrae being snapped. Now she's got plans to get married, but now her neck is broken. It's her celebration, it's her party, but her neck has been broken at her celebration. She said, while they were interviewing her, she said, we put the wedding plans on hold, but as soon as I got therapy and got use of my arms again, I knew I would never walk. She said, but I knew I was going to get married. She said, so I made out my guest list. And she said, when I submitted my guest list, she said, I submitted it. And the lady that was interviewing her said, Rachel, did you include your friend that pushed you into the pool? She said, why wouldn't I include my friend? She said, you don't understand. That was a simple accident. Could have happened to anybody. She said, so the interviewer said, did you forgive her? She said, forgive her? I didn't have to forgive her. She said, because I never blamed her. She said, you have to realize that some stuff just happens in life. And let me tell you, Rachel got married, had her friend there, and everything went well. But watch what happens. Even though she'll never walk, there is one thing she will never do. She said she'll never hate anybody because she will never hold unforgiveness in her heart. Let me tell somebody in here that it does not matter what the injury is in your life that has occurred. You've got to learn how to forgive and keep on moving because God has more for you. So you got to understand, forgiveness is to cancel an indebtedness or to grant a pardon. And that's what Jesus does on Calvary. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Now you got to realize that this unforgiveness has been said. When you choose not to forgive a person, that's unforgiveness. And unforgiveness has been said is you drinking the poison but hoping the other person dies. And many of us, we have this mentality of unforgiveness that we're going to hang on to our hate. We're going to hang on to our pity. We're going to hang on to our dislike and disdain as though we're hurting somebody else. But you're not hurting them. They moved on with their life. They still getting married, still having kids, still going to work, still eating, and you still talking about, I hate them. I don't like them. You better move on with your life because you are holding on to something that's keeping you held up when you really need to let it go and let God deal with it. The Bible says in verse 34, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. They have no idea. You see, who is the them and the they he's talking about? Because he says, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Who is the them and they? I'm glad y'all asked. The them and the they. Jesus has to deal with the them and the they, first of all, of his immediate world. In other words, there are those that are right there at the cross that he's got to forgive. He's got to ask God to forgive. In other words, there are those that are responsible for placing him on the cross. There are those that have beat him, that have spit on him. There are those that have kicked him. There's the lictor that has beaten him. There's those that have placed the stage in his hand. Those that have lied on him. There are those that have taken his garments and cast them. And watch this. They have made fun of him and his title and said he's the Son of God and he can't even save himself. He's got to forgive all of that. So understand, Jesus has to deal with them and they of his immediate world, those that are at the cross. But Jesus also has to deal with those in the entire world. In other words, you have those that are at the cross. That's his immediate world. But then you have those that are in the entire world, those of us. Now, Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 to verse 15 says, so effectively did he purge us of our sin when he took them out there on the cross and nailed them to the tree. I like that because it allows us to know that once we confess our sin to him, that everything has already been paid for because Jesus has already taken the penalty. And watch this, he took it to the cross. And somebody ought to be able to celebrate that all of your junk, all of your filth, all of your stuff, all of the stench that you have has been taken to Calvary's cross. And it's a whole lot of us that need to realize that we can thank God all because of what he did on Calvary. And every now and then you got to thank God that you don't allow the linger too long in the stench of your hurt and you smell like the toxin you hate, because that's what occurs when you linger too long in the stench of your hurt. You smell like the toxin you hate. And it's a whole lot of us that the reason why we can't move on is because we smell bad, we look bad, we act bad, because we've been lingering too long in the stench of our hurt. I know it hurt you. I know it seemed as if God abandoned you. But you got to realize God didn't abandon you. He's right there where he's always been.
Thank you for allowing us to come into your home, your job, your hospital room, or even your prison cell. Until next time, may God's peace be with you.
We believe in praising God. Come on, let's praise. Come on, lift those hands up and give him glory.